Long gone are the days when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister of Australia and when his country enjoyed good relations with China. Tensions are now at a critical high after the formation of Aukus, a new security pact between Australia, the US and the UK.
Australia has a long history of defence cooperation with the United States and the United Kingdom.
Under the deal, Australia will acquire US technology to build nuclear-powered submarines, a move that has upset and alarmed Beijing.
This deliberately exacerbates regional tensions, fuels an arms race, and threatens regional peace and stability.
What does it mean for the region? And how real is the threat of war between the US and China?
What is the danger in the 2020s is conflict not by intention or design, but conflict by accident.
Former Prime Minister of Australia Kevin Rudd, now a respected China scholar and analyst, unpacks all this and more on Talking Post.
People need to be very careful about the loose use of the term Cold War.
Kevin Rudd, thank you very much for joining us. You were the Australian Prime Minister between 2007 and 2013, and that was a time I remember when you spoke about a true friendship, building a true friendship with China. There was a lot of positivity back then. There was a lot of outward looking, the mentality was like that. It was about reaching out, it was about friendship. All of that has changed drastically over the past few years especially. What happened in your assessment? Can you encapsulate that for us? What went wrong? Why did we all go downhill from that point?
Well, I think it's important not to see it as going wrong, but what changed. And I think two or three things have changed. The first thing is since 2012-13, China has changed. China's domestic politics have changed. China's economic policy direction has changed. China's attitude to the assertion of its international policy interests has changed. And we see, therefore, a different substance and style to China's diplomacy and, if you like, its power projection around the world. The second thing that changed in the period since then, of course, is the binary state of the US-China relationship. This became most acute under Trump with the trade war, but has continued through the trade war to the present in the Biden administration, this new age of strategic competition. So that's a change. And the third is in Australia, with the election of the Conservative government in Australia in late 13, early 14, there is often a predisposition on the part of Australian Conservatives to, as it were, play to Washington and London rather than to deal with the realities and complexities of the region. It's been an enduring thematic in Australian foreign policy history. So if you ask what's changed, I think there have been three big variables at work, but we live in challenging times.
Well, let's talk about Australia's role in all this, and of course, Australia's new partnership with the US and the UK, this new arrangement they call Aukus, and the transfer of nuclear technology, nuclear submarines to Australia. I want to ask, how much of this, when we talk about the upsetting the balance of power in this part of the world and all the alarmist talk about nuclear war, Cold War, confrontation between China and Australia, how much of that is reality and how much of it is, at the end of the day, we're talking about arms sales, the business of arms sales, which the US is a major player in, the main player, you might say. And people could look at it this way, which is Afghanistan. The US is done with Afghanistan. 20 years of war there. War is a profit-based industry, and the US military-industrial complex has made a lot of money there. But that's over. They've pulled out of Afghanistan. The mess that you have there, we can debate that forever. But that is over. Also, the US still needs to sell arms. So primarily, are we being alarmist when we talk about the upping the ante in the region to a dangerous level, or should we just look at this as this is the US just selling arms again, and it's found a new partner to do it to, at the expense of its existing partner like France, you might say?
Well, I think if you looked at the aggregate balance of military power in East Asia and the West Pacific, US armed forces in the region have basically remained constant in size and in deployment and in sophistication. What's changed actually is the rapid expansion of the PLA, the Navy, the Air Force, as well as, of course, a whole range of paramilitary vessels which are currently active in the South China Sea. Aircraft carrier developments, the expansion of China's SSN and SSBN fleets, the modernization of Chinese rocket forces. So this is a new dynamic. I make no observation of whether it's justified or not. I'm simply being an analyst. A further dynamic, of course, has been increased military expenditure by Japan, third largest economy in the world. And when Japan decides to increase its outlays, obviously you have much more by way of military activity around the region as well. So I think that's the strategic environment in which we find this most recent debate about Aukus occurring. The second point would be this. I think you're right to be skeptical about the strategic significance of Aukus, because when you unpack it all and look at its essence, it's essentially a defence procurement agreement. There is no mutual defence pact here. That already exists between Australia and the United States and has been since 1951. And there is no mutual defence pact between the United Kingdom and Australia under AUKUS or anything else. This is a defence procurement agreement purely about the provision of certain nuclear propulsion technologies. So we need to put this into context. Finally, however, in terms of whether US strategy towards China in the region is driven by the so-called military-industrial complex, I don't think that's accurate at all. For the simple reason is, if you're familiar with the evolution of US strategic doctrine on China, particularly in the period since 2017, it's basically been derived from the US analysis of the changing structure and sophistication of the Chinese military apparatus and changes in China's declaratory policy. We can have a separate debate about whether the American response is fully appropriate or not, but I think it's wrong analysis to say it's driven by the defense dollar.
Well, if you look at, I mean, a lot of the talk is, and you just touched upon that as well, which is a lot of it is the response to how China is dealing in the behaving. I keep hearing this behavior of China, behaving in the South China Sea in terms of the militarization and the expansion of its territory or claims that it lays to its territory, etc. So a lot of that, we talk about China's behavior and China's neighbors merely reacting to the way China is building up its military and its presence in the South China Sea. But can you also look at it from China's point of view in terms of the number of military bases there, hundreds, the US and its allies? There, it's when you look at it, you have a bird's eye view of it, it's almost like China is surrounded and is under a state of siege. And then you couple this with the constant rhetoric and dialogue about China must behave, China must do this, China must do that, China is a threat, etc. But when you talk about the threat from China, in the last 30 years or so, China has not fought a hot war. It has not waged war. It has not invaded any country with a military force and started bombing the population. And the countries that accuse China of being a threat or are alarmed by China's threat, those countries have been actively involved in wars, including your own. So from the Chinese point of view, can you see how this lectures on how it must behave? Otherwise, its neighbors do have a right to defend themselves and protect themselves in this manner.
I'm not in the business of providing anyone with a public lecture. I'm simply being an analyst.
Sure.
Because I run a think tank, that's what I do. And I analyze change. Firstly, the Chinese strategic perspective is exactly as you've described. In fact, I detailed this in an extensive lecture to the West Point Military Academy in the United States a couple of years ago, outlining Xi Jinping's worldview, looking at how they sense that they are bottled in on their eastern maritime periphery, and China's expansion, therefore, through the Belt and Road Initiative through its western continental periphery. And therefore, when China looks at its maritime history, particularly since the Opium Wars, China has a particular view of its exposure to the great powers, the colonial powers, the neo-colonial powers, the Japanese occupation, not just through Manchuria, but also in maritime operations into Shanghai and along the Chinese coast. These are all factors shaping China's current strategic posture and China's current strategic aspirations, including what remains a maritime preoccupation with how to recover Taiwan to Chinese national sovereignty. So those are all givens. However, in the real world of strategic analysis, perceptions is one thing, actual military deployments and changes in those deployments are another. And what has happened by way of change in the last 5 to 7 years is A, China reclaimed 7 islands in the South Pacific, and then, despite assurances to the contrary, then militarized them. That's the first change. The second is in the East China Sea, after the Japanese changed the status quo by nationalizing Senkaku Diaoyudao and turning them into Japanese sovereign territory, China then for the first time began deploying large numbers of aircraft and vessels into the surrounding EEZ, and then declared an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea. And thirdly, on the Sino-Indian border, most analysts would agree that in fact what we're looking at is China having moved effectively through a series of operations, the line of control between Delhi and Beijing in the 2 disputed areas of the Sino-Indian border. And so as a consequence, the argument, which military analysts would say, is that in these 3 domains, China has changed the status quo. As you could argue also, the United States and its allies changed the status quo after 1945. But we should not pretend that this is, as it were, a static environment. It's changing, and therefore one change gives rise to another set of changes.
Let's go back to Australia again. Australia has a bit of a delicate balancing act, and that's what it's been dealing with for a long time now, walking a fine line between confronting China or containing China or countering the perceived threats from China, and also being loyal to its traditional Western allies. And somehow, during your government's time as well, when the belligerence was not so high, you were able to manage this. Right now, how do they do this? Because you're reliant, your country is reliant on China for trade, and you can see the impact already from the trade punishment that China is meting out due to Australia's, increased friendship with the US to the extent that it was also asking for a COVID inquiry. We don't have to debate that, whether that was justified or not. But what I mean is, in terms of all that, and considering the balance of power, considering the need for peace in this region, we're already in a state of Cold War, let's say, between the US and China, and not making it worse. How does Australia walk this very fine line?
Well, firstly, I dispute the fact that we are currently in a Cold War. The defining features of a Cold War...
Between the US and China? Not Australia. I'm not talking about Australia yet. The US and China.
No, I'm about to say we are not in a Cold War yet between China and the United States. A Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States had the following characteristics: living on a nuclear precipice against each other, a rolling daily ideological war, thirdly, zero economic engagement. And 2 of those 3 factors are not present at present. The ideological divide is there is some decoupling on the economy occurring, but the enmeshment of the 2 economies is still significant. And we do not have daily threats of mutual nuclear annihilation. So people need to be very careful about the loose use of the term Cold War. I believe there is a trend in that direction, but we are a long way off it yet. Secondly, all American allies in East Asia have a parallel dilemma to Australia's, whether it's the Republic of Korea, whether it's Japan, whether it's the Republic of the Philippines, whether it's the Kingdom of Thailand, whether it's Australia. And non-allies like India face it as well, which is principal economic partner because of China's economic size is Beijing, and the security partner of choice, usually through allied arrangements, is the United States. So Australia is not Robinson Crusoe here. Third point is that in terms of the management, however, of Australia's strategic interests, my argument has always been that we need to balance both our continued military collaboration with the United States, who have been close allies of ours for about 100 years, at the same time deepening our diplomatic and economic engagement with all countries within the region. If I have a critique in terms of the posture of the current Australian government, it emphasises the first and does not emphasise the second. I am concerned, for example, that Australia's current engagement with Southeast Asia is not as strong as it was in previous periods of Australian governments.
When you're talking about, you said there is, you don't see a Cold War in existence right now. What about the threat of a real war? Given this latest deal with Australia and the tensions now in the Western Alliance, China's very strong position on Taiwan, etc. Do you see the potential for things to escalate and actually get out of control, with or without this Cold War as a preamble?
It depends entirely what time frame we're looking at. If you're looking at the 2020s, over the course of the next decade, I think the probability of a hot war between China and the United States is limited. Limited in terms of the intentionality of either side. China is not seeking to go to war with the United States over Taiwan, nor is the United States seeking to go to war with China over Taiwan. That may change as China's relative military position against the United States improves, and perhaps by decade's end, China concludes that its military capacity to take Taiwan by force will be sufficiently large to dissuade the Americans from militarily engaging in the first place, or if they do so, that China would then be confident that they would prevail. What is the danger in the 2020s is conflict not by intention or design, but conflict by accident.
Yes.
And that is an incident creating that. So therefore, we need to be vigilant about that, particularly all the variables at play, collisions in the air, collisions at sea, but also what I describe as political collisions, particularly if after 2024 you end up with a much stronger pro-independentist government under the DPP in Taiwan. That would add a new uncontrollable variable in the equation. So we need to build what I describe as strategic guardrails in the China-US relationship so that unanticipated events can be managed on the way through rather than simply becoming triggers for a wider conflagration, as certainly occurred, for example, if we're students of history, back in 1914.
When we talk about Australia's strategic interests here and the action it does need to take vis-a-vis what actions China is taking, etc., in the South China Sea, that's on one level. On the other level, when we're talking about Australia actually engaging in the details of matters such as, say, Hong Kong, for example. Australia recently, or some time back now, talked about offering safe haven to Hong Kongers in danger, to warning its citizens in Hong Kong to watch out for this national security law that's in effect here. Now, I live in Hong Kong, and I have a pretty good idea of how this national security law works, and also in the context of what happened here in 2019 when you had utter anarchy and violence on the streets and all kinds of stuff that went on. So Australia, on the one hand, while protecting its strategic interests, how do you see its involvement in the nitty-gritty of arguments between the US and China, where Hong Kong is often used as a little middle point where you can talk about, look at human rights in Hong Kong, etc. How much of that is actually important to Australia?
Well, Australia is a liberal democracy, and Australia is not alone in that. The posture of Australia on these questions of liberal democracy and the universality of human rights proceeds also from the Universal Declaration on Human Rights of 1948, which all countries in the region have signed and have ratified, including China. And secondly, it proceeds from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1967, which all countries in the region have signed, although in China's case, not yet ratified. And so we would simply anchor our position on what those two international covenants say, as opposed to a subjective view held by a particular Western government at a particular time. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that the reason we have a Human Rights Council in Geneva is that it's created under international law, not by the Americans, not by the Australians, not by the Russians, not by anybody else, to uphold those two conventions. And so when you see the matters that you've just referred to being taken up in the HRC, that's the forum which international law was used to create those bodies in the first place. And again, I think it's probably not accurate to pinpoint Australian critiques as being uniquely Australian. They come from Canada, they come from the United States, they come from New Zealand, they come from Japan. They also come from virtually every member state of the European Union and other democracies as well. So therefore, there is always going to be tension on this question in terms of a classical Chinese communist view of rights and a one-party state, and its view that that rights should always be subject to the power of the ruling party, versus a universalist view of rights anchored in this international treaty law. So you're going to have this as a continuing structural tension.
Yeah, that's what's happening in Hong Kong right now as well. That's exactly the same debate going on in Hong Kong. Kevin, what do you think of the role of the media in all this in terms of helping people to understand stuff or exacerbating the situation? I mean, for example, with the Hong Kong reporting, we had a lot of problems with Western media reporting, very black and white, with no acknowledgement whatsoever of the many shades of grey and other colours in between. You've clashed a lot with, this is an issue that bothers you as well with the Murdoch media, right?
Well, in the business of international relations, you're always going to have a problem in terms of foreign newspapers and foreign media organisations reporting local nuance. It's just a problem. And so you would have had a lot of international reporting, for example, about the popular reaction in Hong Kong, back to the original umbrella movement of 2014 through to the more recent actions in 2019 over the Hong Kong government's efforts to change the extradition law. And we saw what happened as a result of that. You saw Beijing's reaction to that. You saw the national security law being implemented. And you've now seen a series of actions taken against individuals in Hong Kong. The bottom line is you will only have a certain amount of that covered, as it were, in the international media. And the reality which all countries face is they'll take the big topics and the big headlines, and they will not take the smaller stories and the smaller headlines which deal with people's day-to-day lives. That's just reality. We could all wish it was different, but that's just reality. But the truth is, in Hong Kong, things have changed. The national security law is new. It's a new reality. And therefore, as a consequence, when you have individuals, whether it's newspaper proprietors or Hong Kong democratic activists who are charged and in some cases convicted of offences, that is new. That was not the way Hong Kong was several years ago. So therefore, because it's new, it constitutes news, and therefore it will be covered. On the broader question of the degree of, as it were, effective political, personal, economic liberty in Hong Kong now compared with the past, then of course, you're going to have a wide range of views as to how ordinary people's lives have changed or not.
All right, I'm afraid we've reached the end of our time here, so we'll have to end it here. Thank you very much for your time and for sharing your expertise and wisdom. Much appreciated. Thank you.
It's good to be with you.